We're going to be talking again, as we have the last couple of Sunday nights that I've preached, about the book of Ruth. We're going to look at chapter 3 tonight, and I've just entitled this, Waiting, Difficult to Do. Sometimes it is. So we'll examine the events in the life of Ruth, and last time we left off at the end of chapter 2, which of course is where chapter 3 picks up, and chapter 2 finished where the first chapter, began where the first chapter finished. So think back with me 3,000 years ago to this period of time. We think of the Judges. I think we mentioned that this morning, and a lot of things that weren't so good happening at that point in time as far as Israel was concerned. And yet we get a glimpse of light here in the book of Ruth as to how those who are serving God can do so even in very difficult times. You'll recall that Elimelech, an Israelite, moved his family to Moab, a place that didn't have such a wonderful spiritual environment, because there was a famine. And so he took them from this promised land, from Bethlehem, and moved them to Moab. And there he and his 2 sons both died. His sons had married, and that left 3 widows in this foreign land. And then they heard that there was food back in Bethlehem, back in Israel. And so Naomi decided to go back, and Ruth, her daughter-in-law, goes with her. She leaves all behind. She embraces Jehovah as God, and she goes with her. So chapter 2 picks up where Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, and yet they really don't have as yet any food or any income, and Ruth decides to head for the fields and go to work. And so she ends up in the field of Boaz, a very influential bachelor who lived in Bethlehem. And unknown to Ruth, Boaz is related to Ruth's in-laws. And so Boaz befriends Ruth. He is very kind and good towards her, and he protects Ruth during this 7 weeks of harvest. And so we talked about those events last time. And so there at the end of the chapter 2, you've got almost a perfect Hollywood script for a happy ending, don't you? You've got a single wealthy landowner who meets this impoverished young widow from the other side of the tracks. And, all there is for them to do is to fall in love and ride off into the sunset on a camel. But it doesn't happen that way, does it? When you start reading in chapter 3, harvest has ended, and Ruth's work is over, but as far as Ruth and Boaz, really nothing much has happened. And so Naomi, it seems, decides to lend a helping hand, and that's where we pick up in chapter 3. And so we'll think about some of the things that take place here. As I say, the plot thickens, and notice what takes place. And of course, we've got to be careful not to romanticize the Bible according to our ideas about things. And we don't have all the details. We just know what is described to us here and what transpires. But I think what transpires is important. That's why it's recorded for us, these 4 brief chapters in this great book of Ruth. And so Boaz has taken an interest in Ruth. He shows a concern for her, but it seems to have stopped there. He doesn't seem to, over that 7 weeks, have advanced the relationship in any meaningful way. And so, there may be reasons for that. He is a native landowner. She is a foreign, kind of a scavenger in a sense. Maybe he's being sensitive to her as a widow, having understood her position. Maybe she's still in mourning. We're just not told about that. And it may be that Ruth wasn't expecting much either, because if you go back to chapter 2 and verse 13, when Ruth was explaining about what had happened or talking to Boaz, it says, she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." Sounds a little bit like the prodigal son, doesn't it? That I'm going to go back home and you make me like one of your servants, She says, I'm not really even one of your servants. So Ruth doesn't apparently have any grand designs on things. And so as we look at this third chapter, I want to note two or three things here as we look at the events that take place. First of all, bear in mind that these individuals, like us, are people, and we sometimes use the description free moral agents. Well, what's that mean? That's kind of a fancy sounding term. What it means is that we're agents, we act, we do things. Secondly, that those actions have implications. They're moral in nature. Right and wrong is sometimes a result of the decisions that we make, and we're free. We make our choices. I make mine, you make yours. And so we're all acting in this way. God allows that to happen. Secondly, we'll point out here an element of risk. And by risk, I don't mean, going to the casino and getting dialed into the slot machine and putting coins in there to try to make a lot of money in a minute that we never earned. And it's all a result of chance. And it's kind of a greedy disposition in essence is what it's. That's not what we're talking about risk. We're talking about the fact that sometimes we make decisions and we're affected by the decisions of others, and things can change for us one way or the other. So there is that element to life. And then thirdly, there is certainly God's providence, God acting behind the scenes. I think we see that in a number of events that take place in this book, as well as certainly others biblically. So let's look at what happens here at chapter 3, and notice that as I say, in the first 4 verses, Naomi initiates some action on her part and Ruth's part. And so what she says in verse 1 is, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? So Naomi is looking at this matter of rest. It's interesting, this is the same word that she used back in chapter 1 and verse 9 when she was departing to go back to Bethlehem, and she said to her daughters-in-law, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Of course, Ruth decided to go with her. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. This idea of rest is the expectation, I think, certainly on Naomi's part, of a certain security and tranquility, particularly that a loving husband could provide. Now, Collie spoke in class this morning about Eve, and we've talked about Adam. And certainly in Genesis 2:24, as he pointed out this morning, there is this relationship that God designed and created this first man and woman to be a part of. And it's interesting to me that the woman is said to be the helpmate, the helper. What does that suggest? Who needs the help? It's the male, the husband, that needs the help. And so the woman is designed to help him. But in that relationship, there is this opportunity for blessing that God has to give to a man and woman who commit themselves to each other. And so here it is that Naomi has the expectation of certain economic necessities, food, clothing, shelter, and certainly looking at the future, approaching the future, an ability to calm anxieties about what the future holds. And so a couple who commit themselves to each other can accomplish a great deal. And I would simply suggest that's not unlike what a wife might seek today. Now, I know there are a lot of people that would say, oh, come on, we're living in the 21st century. Are you telling me that that's the kind of attitude that a wife would have in reference to her husband? Well, that's the biblical model. There is that expectation, certainly, of each toward the other. But this idea of rest, I think, is a biblical one. And so Naomi follows Ruth's actions in chapter 2. We talked about taking that next step. Well, that seems to be exactly what she prescribes for Ruth. And so she seems to be recovering from her bitterness. this idea that God was somehow trying to judge her or punish her. And over time, it's possible that time can heal certain wounds. It seems to be happening to some extent for Naomi, and especially as she considers God's blessings. And isn't that often the case, that when we look at what God has given us and not just at the things that have happened to us, that's the case? And so she begins to acknowledge God's goodness, his kindness, the things that he has done. And so here she suggests this idea of the kinsman redeemer, and that is part of God's providence. God had set up the kinsman redeemer for the nation of Israel, really to protect the promised land. Each family, each tribe would receive their allotted portion of land. And by having this kinsman redeemer rule, so to speak, this land could never be permanently sold, where it could not be obtained again. So if a family hit hard times, and they sometimes do, why, they might have to sell their land, but then there was opportunity for a near relative, a kinsman, to buy back that land, to redeem it for this poor relative. Leviticus 25 has a number of things to say about that. And so here is Naomi, and what she does is, in verse 2, she wonders, would Boaz redeem this situation for them? Verse 2, is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? And so she proposes that Ruth approach him on the threshing floor where the grain is sifted. They've just finished harvest. And so verse 2 continues, see, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. This threshing floor, of course, is the place where the grain was being threshed. We have machines that do that today, but back at that time, they would find a suitable location, maybe someplace flat, someplace maybe an outcrop of rock, and maybe something that was elevated, because that would allow the winds, the breezes to blow, and they would try to thresh the grain from the heads of grain, and then they would throw the grain and the chaff up into the air. The chaff would be blown away, and only the grain would remain. And so that seems to be the scene here, and it probably would have been typical to celebrate at the end of a harvest. And of course, they might stay near to this grain that had been harvested in order to protect it, both from maybe animals or thieves. And so that seems to be the occasion here. Now, Naomi proposes to Ruth, verse 3, you wash and anoint yourself, and you put on your cloak. And again, it's hard to know exactly, precisely what's being described here. This is reminiscent of another passage, David, over in 2 Samuel chapter 12. And you recall that his child on that occasion was sick and then finally died. And it says in verse 20, then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes. He seems to go through the same protocol there. Whatever that is, maybe again, it has something to do, some have suggested, with Ruth ending this period of mourning. But Naomi is suggesting that she approach Boaz and make this request of him concerning this matter of the kinsman redeemer. One other word we might say about that cloak. This seems to be an outer garment that one could wear. And again, David had such a cloak, but it could also serve for someone who was not very well off as kind of a cover at night. And that might be behind this statement in Exodus 22. You'll probably recall it. Verse 25, if you lend money to any of my people, with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. And one of the expressions of that is verse 26, if ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. Well, why before the sun goes down? Possibly because they might be needing it when the sun goes down. as a blanket to cover themselves. That's the same word there, this cloak, this outer garment. And so Naomi is encouraging Ruth to take advantage of this opportunity. Well, as we pick up there in verse 3, she's got this plan. She says, take your cloak, put on your cloak, go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, verse 4, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. Now, this section of chapter 3 has elicited a lot of questions as to what's going on here. You know, is Naomi urging Ruth to just kind of throw herself at Boaz out of desperation? Is this some kind of attempt on her part to seduce him? And you can imagine, it must be said that at the time of Judges, you've got actions that you read about like those where people are pretty much willing to do whatever they would. And at a time of celebrating, when the grain has been harvested, it's not hard to imagine that that might happen. But that's not what's happening here. Ruth is really venturing, and Naomi's encouraging her to take a step toward a God-ordained solution. And I think both the character of Ruth and Boaz suggests that all that happens here is above board. Their intentions and their actions are honorable in this matter. Ruth is going to let Boaz know that she's willing for him to redeem her. And that's in keeping with the commands of God. Now, keep in mind that that makes Ruth somewhat vulnerable. By which I mean, when you propose something to someone, especially of this kind of nature, well, you're taking a risk, so to speak. Boaz might say no. And I think we learn as young people, you know, when we get interested in somebody else that, yeah, that's wonderful, but there's always the chance that somebody else isn't going to be interested in us. And so there's that vulnerability that emerges. And that's because human emotions and actions are involved. Well, anyway, that's the plan. Why Ruth go and seek him out. So what does Ruth do? Well, first of all, she acts according to what Naomi proposes. Look at verse 6. She went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. So Ruth is doing what Naomi asked her to do. And then we're told in verse 7, when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Now, again, you know, it has been conjectured, well, maybe Boaz is just off getting drunk and then he goes and lies down and he doesn't know what's going on. Again, during the time of the Judges, I can see that that would be a possibility, but I think there is no suggestion here that that's what's taking place. Rather that he has eaten, he has had his fill, and then he comes down to lay down by the grain. And then we're told in the second part of verse 7, Ruth comes softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And then look at verses 8 and 9. It says, at midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. Now, he was startled. Have you ever awakened at midnight and been startled by something? Not very surprising, is it? Especially if we're in a deep sleep. I've got an Apple Watch and it keeps track of your sleep and it tells you how much is deep sleep. So, you know, that seems to be significant. Well, if you're sleeping deeply and you wake up and something's there that you're not expecting, you're going to be startled. And that's exactly what happens here. Here is this woman lying at his feet. And so he said, verse 9, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now, what's going on here? Well, it may very well be that in this culture, this action on Ruth's part, this matter of placing a garment on someone or maybe uncovering is like a marriage proposal. That might seem strange to us, but that could well have been the practice at this time. And so she goes one more step, asking him to act as a kinsman redeemer. In other words, can you be responsible for my family, my extended family, both physically and financially? She's not proposing to Boaz, but she is proposing that he propose. If he proposes, she's letting him know that she would say yes. That seems to me to be what's going on here. And maybe that suggests some reasons why Boaz has not yet stepped forward. As we've said all through this, there are some inequities here, at least on the surface, that might appear. And so Ruth is kind of taking a step of faith in doing this. She's a Moabite. He's a Jew. She's a young widow. As we said, maybe she's still mourning. He's an older bachelor. Her work has just ended. He's the one that's in charge of everything. And of course, in our culture, if there were some kind of possible relationship like this, nowadays, it's just commonplace for someone to say, well, let's just move in together. Let's just try this out. And the problem is that's not part of God's design. They didn't act to see if they were compatible with each other. Instead, they acted based upon God's counsel and wisdom. And so that is not even in the consideration there. So look at verse 10. It says, he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. So once again, Boaz is impressed with the example of Ruth. He saw that, he'd heard that when she was working in the fields and caring for her mother-in-law. And now he sees the same kind of thing. And he suggests that her kindness has been great. We've talked about this word before, hesed, this Hebrew word, which suggests a loyalty, a devotion to someone or something. It's often used of God and his attitude toward us. Well, here it's being used by Boaz of Ruth in her concern and her kindness toward others. And so he says in verse 11, and now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. So we kind of get an insight now into Boaz. And again, maybe one of the reasons that he has not acted as quickly as we might have assumed is because he speaks of her kindness and not having gone after the younger men. Maybe he just thought, well, I'm too old for her. She's got other suitors that might be more interested in her. At any rate, he speaks about her kindness and he describes her as a worthy woman. That's the same word used back in chapter 2, verse 1 of Boaz. It is this word, Hebrew word, that is sometimes used of the mighty men that would fight great battles, for instance, when David had his group of mighty men. But it seems to suggest not just physical might, but this idea of worth and value in terms of integrity and the kind of things that would accompany it. And so he promises her that he won't take advantage of her. He's not going to look down upon her because of the fact she has asked for help. And he'll do all he can to take part. In fact, note the promise that he makes in verses 12 and 13. He says, now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. So again, it's revealed to us that Boaz is aware that there's someone closer than he is. But he invokes the name of God. As the Lord lives, he says, I will redeem you if it's possible for me to do that. And then he says, just remain here until the morning. And so I think we are impressed with the character of both of these individuals. Ruth has made her action. She's followed Naomi's instructions. And Boaz has received her graciously and indicated that he was willing to act on her stead and really on the stead of her extended family. Well, notice in verse 14, she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. I think there's a sense here in which Boaz doesn't have her go away immediately in the night. That's not going to be very safe. And yet he recognizes that these actions can be misinterpreted. And so she rises early before others have arisen, but not before Boaz shows his concern for her by sending her away with 6 measures of barley, verse 15, for her mother-in-law. And so Ruth goes home, and when she came, verse 16, to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Well, in verse 18, listen to Naomi's reply. And her reply is, very simply, she replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Now, I realize that this was a very short time for which she is suggesting that Ruth waits. But I think that serves as a lesson to us to think about what it takes sometimes to wait. Wait when we're wanting to know what might happen in a given situation. And that is Naomi's advice to Ruth. And I think based upon God's counsel to us, it's good counsel. Sometimes we just have to wait in order to determine and find out what it is that's going to happen. We want to know sooner. What happens may impact us, and we're concerned about it, but sometimes that's the only option that we have. And so if it's a situation we can't control, what else can we do but rely upon God and trust in Him? Ruth and Naomi really both are going to wait and see how Boaz will respond. Will he be able to take up this mantle of concern and care for this family? Will he act in a gracious way toward Ruth in taking her not only as this kinsman redeemer, but also in marriage? And when you think about it, there's a little sense of our having a kinsman redeemer. That's who Jesus is. Think about Jesus' statement in Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. We all need the rest that God has promised us in His Son, Jesus Christ. And so we are reliant upon Him. Now, I guess the difference is here, Jesus has come, He has given Himself, He has made it known what He will do. There's no doubt about that. But He is waiting for us if we have not responded to His overtures, His grace and His love. And there is that opportunity for us. Well, let's think as we conclude here with this chapter about some applications for ourselves. As I say, we might sometimes find ourselves vulnerable just because of circumstances or because of decisions that others are making. And I would even suggest that as Christians, we are often vulnerable because God says, that's what I want you to be. When Jesus said, if someone slaps you on the cheek, you turn the other cheek. Now, we may discuss exactly what that means, but isn't that a certain vulnerability? Where He says, you don't necessarily have the upper hand. You don't have the advantage over someone. You may be at a disadvantage because you're serving Christ in the way that you do. But I want you to do that. That's how I want you to serve me. So we might find ourselves in that situation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. it can lead to a certain degree of anxiety. You know, when you think about planning out things, it's good to plan, isn't it? Have you ever used the program Excel? You may not know what that is, but if you're an accountant, you probably do. Excel is a spreadsheet that you can use. It's wonderful. It's marvelous. It does all sorts of calculations for you. You can plan out the next year if you want to. But the problem is things don't always go like we intend for them to go, despite our planning. Life can be very volatile, and we don't always know the conditions and the outcomes. And so sometimes we have to wait and simply trust in God. And as I say, that can then turn into a certain degree of anxiety if we're not careful, causing despair that the person that we vote for doesn't get elected. What are we going to do? The position that we're perfect for goes to somebody else instead of ourselves. The health that we expected and counted on suddenly disappears. The child who is going to care for us in our old age won't even speak to us. We can think of situations like those, and they're difficult situations. And what are we going to do when that happens? What we have to do is to put our trust in our God. We have to trust others sometimes. We have to do the right thing, regardless of what the circumstance may be, and to seek God and His kingdom. And He promises that He will take care of us and provide for us. Well, let's go to Psalm 73. I think it's a great way to summarize what we're talking about, taking refuge in God. Psalm 73 is this great psalm in which Asaph, who apparently is a song leader, more or less, in the temple, says this in verses 1 to 3, "Truly God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." So here is someone who can't understand how the wicked are prospering. And he's a religious official. He has a confidence in God, and he says, this was affecting me. My steps almost slipped. Well, long story short, he comes into God's presence. He assembles with God's people, and that changes his whole perspective. I think that's one of the reasons that we meet. And one of the benefits that we can get out of meeting is when we're with each other, we're focusing on God, we're focusing on His Word, it changes our perspective. And so he replies, verses 27 and 28, "But for me it is good to be near God. I have made the Lord God my refuge, that I may tell of all your works." So our question this evening, have you made the Lord your refuge? Maybe there's someone here, not a Christian, you haven't yet put your trust in God. If that's the case, then you need to consider that, because He is the one in whom we can trust. He's the one who will redeem us. And we are willing to make ourselves vulnerable in order to do our service to Him. If you're here and you're subject to that gospel message, won't you come as together we stand?